It's the fall of 1860. One of the most important presidential elections in American history is nearing a close. And Abraham Lincoln is exactly where Americans would expect him to be, at home.
It would be considered uncouth to go out and ask people to vote for you prior to really the 20th century.
Throughout the campaign, Lincoln was sort of the invisible man. He wasn't out giving speeches. He wasn't traveling around the country.
Lincoln was concerned that if he gave public speeches, he might be seen as changing his positions or qualifying his earlier positions, and so he wanted American voters to read the speeches he had given.
By 1860, Lincoln was a veteran campaigner who knew what he needed to do to have a shot at winning. He needs to get the media on his side.
He's inviting journalists to his home to talk with him. He's interacting with the newspapers. He's building a national campaign, even while he's not supposed to be playing an active role.
He was a very deft person at building alliances, at working behind the scenes, and at consolidating friendships, really, with powerful people.
Newspapers are big business in 1860. Some 4,000 are in print around the country, driven by two of the most important technologies of the era, the telegraph and the high-speed printing press. With those presses, news editors could land big-ticket government printing contracts and print enough papers to meet the demands of their eager subscribers.
Every town in America had two newspapers generally, a Republican newspaper and a Democratic newspaper.
All of the newspapers were actually partisan press. One of the things that it was used most commonly for was to, promote these candidates.
If you had a political opinion that you wanted to get out there, you started a newspaper. They did not mind taking swipes at political or social opponents, and some of it is hilarious, and some of it is quite vile.
Without education or refinement.
The more inflammatory something is, if you think it's going to advance your position, it's going to be printed.
Even with their faults, America's papers kept the masses informed and engaged in the biggest issues of the day.
19th century Americans were highly literate, and they read the newspapers every morning.
Few know it at the time, but Lincoln controls a local German-language newspaper. Its circulation in Springfield may have been small, but by sharing its articles over the wire, its influence is amplified with a key voting demographic: German immigrants. Ultimately, though, Lincoln's success might hinge on the opinions of the two most powerful editors in the country: Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune and James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald.
The New York Herald and the New York Tribune really represented a national press that hadn't been there before. Articles that ran there would be picked up in smaller papers throughout the country and amplified, and the pro-Republican, the pro-Democratic rhetoric that was published in those newspapers really became a kind of a deafening din throughout the country.
By this point in the campaign, Lincoln had already won over the Republican anti-slavery editor of the Tribune, Horace Greeley.
Mr. Lincoln is one of nature's orators.
James Gordon Bennett and his New York Herald had proven a more difficult nut to crack.
Lincoln is an abolitionist of reddest dye.
It's technically an independent paper, but really it's an aggressive, sarcastic paper that will go after whatever they see as an easy target.
He is liable to become the plaything of his party should he gain control of the government.
Lincoln's behavior may not have inspired much controversy, but in this era of rampant partisanship and racism, his party's push to end the spread of slavery did. Bennett's cynical voice could be heard around the country throughout that election cycle.
Mr. Lincoln is a tall, thin man.
Add that he is dark complexioned.
Thin man, dark complexioned, and apparently quick in his perceptions.
Good, yes.
In an era when photojournalism was in its infancy, readers relied on the colorful accounts of reporters and alleged eyewitnesses printed in their local dailies. every story painted a picture for readers, sometimes many different pictures. Consider the coverage of the brawl that broke out outside the New York Hotel in Manhattan on September 25th of that year. A group of wide awakes, a boisterous pro-Lincoln Republican movement, is meeting in town, across the street from a known pro-slavery Southern Democrat hangout. What happens next, and how it is portrayed, is par for the course in this emotionally charged election year. First, the Democrat version of the story.
Burlington Weekly Sentinel, October 5th, 1860. The wide awakes with their oily, bad-smelling lamps rushed upon the crowd and commenced striking everyone whom they encountered.
And now, for the Republican version.
Lansing State Republican, a rather tall and heavy man, advanced from out of the crowd of Southerners, concluding with, "You sons of bitches, I will whip one of you."
I'll whip any one of you!
We're so partisan. This gives a sense of why historians were very cautious to use newspapers. Newspapers of the 19th century are notoriously unreliable. 19th century Americans were getting almost what we today would call confirmation bias. A Republican would read a Republican newspaper, a Democrat would read a Democratic newspaper. And so as historians, we often have to gather information from multiple sources to try to figure out what actually happened.
By the time Election Day arrives, the nation's printing presses are working overtime. Ballots weren't printed by the government as they are today. They were usually printed by the parties or the newspapers and featured only the candidates backed by those groups. Alongside their ballots, readers absorb a final flurry of articles, pushing for one side or another. By now, the arguments for and against Lincoln and the other candidates are well known, but the language can still be shocking, especially to 21st century ears. And as history will soon show, the rhetoric and the headlines will only grow more extreme once the results of the election are revealed.